Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon. Welcome to everybody who is joining us today for this dialogue organised by the SHARE organisation, which is a research platform for social sciences and arts and humanities researchers who work on ionising radiation. Our dialogue today is titled Critical Reflections on the COP26 conference and the place of nuclear within that. And we have two world-leading experts today who are going to be in dialogue on this topic and sharing their thoughts. I will introduce those people just in a moment. People will be aware that the COP26 conference took place in Glasgow in Scotland not so very long ago. And it was not an easy conference in terms of organisation in COVID times, but still appeared on the surface at least to achieve a number of significant steps forwards, but for many people, not enough. And so the dialogue inevitably continues on the climate crisis and the place of people within the climate crisis, action that needs to be taken, but also the need for social science and humanities research in that arena. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our two speakers today. Gaston Meskens holds master's degrees in theoretical physics and nuclear engineering from the University of Ghent in Belgium. He works part-time with the Science and Technology Studies Group at the Belgian Nuclear Research Centre and also with the Centre for Ethics and Value Inquiry at the University of Ghent. He has over 20 years experience in participative and transdisciplinary research on the ethics and governance in relation to sustainable development, climate change, and radioactive waste management. He's worked with many transnational UN organisations, ensuring that critical voices are heard in these arenas. And he was chair between 2016 and 2018 of the leading constituency that represents the scientific world in the climate change negotiation process. He's also been involved with many participatory processes in Belgium and elsewhere in relation to technologies which have ethical challenges around them. So welcome, Gaston. I'll also introduce Joost de Moor, who's Assistant Professor in Political Science at Sciences Po in Paris, France. His work focuses on the various ways in which citizens who are concerned about the environment become politically active, and that's either individually or collectively. How do these people address their concerns? How do activists navigate political contexts marked by an inability of nation states and other large organisations within society to move in the way that societies wish them to? He's published on these topics in numerous international journals and across fields of political science, sociology, and urban studies. So those are our two speakers today. If you have questions, please pose them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and collating questions, and we will save those until after the dialogue has finished. The chat function is visible to all participants, just so you know. So if you're expressing views, please be mindful of this. We are recording and the questions that you ask in the chat, the recording and the presentations will be available on the SHARE website in a few days. Somebody will post the link to the SHARE website shortly. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pass over to Gaston first, who will then pass on to Joost, and they will share presentations and give their views. Thank you, Gaston.
Thank you, Susan, for this introduction. And of course, I also want to thank the SHARE network to give myself the opportunity, together with my colleague Joost, to really share some ideas, some reflections on the climate change conference in a broader perspective. First, I'm going to try to share my screen. You see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, thank you. So critical observations from the UN Climate Change Conference 2021 and the place of nuclear in the discussion. In my presentation as an introduction, I'm going to give some brief perspectives on the climate change conference itself and on my work. And we agreed to really talk about nuclear as one of the topics more in the discussions. So the state of the planet. I mean, if you really have no time or little time to really update yourself on the state of the planet, I advise you to really take a look at these 3 reports. Why? Because they give really like the best perspective now, they're all from 2021, on what is the state of the planet and of course future perspectives. It's the summary for policymakers of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body that assembles research, current research towards the United Nations. It's a report that's called the Production Gap and a report called the State of the Cryosphere 2021. As you know, the cryosphere is everything ice and snow, so including big ice plates, but also glaciers and the permafrost. First observation from the IPCC report is, of course, you know, this is the well-known hockey stick, the changing of the global average temperature, surface temperature. You see, for instance, now very clearly that this is steeply going up. And the basic message from this one is that it is now clear that humans are changing the climate in the sense that this cannot be assigned anymore to a presumed natural fluctuation. The second highlight I want to take from this report is interesting in terms of future perspectives. The IPCC constructed 5 scenarios of global CO2 emissions in the coming age still up to 2100. And you see 5 scenarios that all will lead to some kind of expected rise in global temperature from plus 1.4 to plus 4.4. The 2 lowest are those taken up in the Paris Agreement. So this is the ultimate goal to go to. These others are really, of course, not wanted. It becomes interesting if we compare this with the predictions from the Production Gap report that predicts how countries are going to produce fossil fuels in the future. So they took a look at the projections of the 15 biggest producers of fossil fuels, so coal, gas, and oil. And you see this very shortly explained. The 2 lowest is what we need to do according to the Paris Agreement. The brown curve is the one that is promised by the countries under the Paris Agreement. The red curve is what they are currently trying to do in their own national programs. You see this one is also the beginning of this one, it overlaps. So you don't have to be a climate scientist to understand that we are in trouble in this sense. And if you think this is trouble enough, there's more to come. Because then the cryosphere report comes. Their basic critique also towards science is that we still see 2100 as a horizon. Also the IPCC is doing it, obviously also for pragmatic reasons. But they warn us that we should also see 2100 as a tipping point. And they warn it with the slogan, we cannot negotiate with the melting point of ice. What is their claim? Their claim is the following. In 2100, even with high emissions, the cryosphere response to global warming, especially that of Earth's great ice sheets, it's really only just getting started. So however, once triggered, they say, that response soon becomes inevitable and essentially permanent on human timescales. For instance, with the problem of polar ocean acidification, they state that the Arctic and Southern Oceans and near polar waters, such as the North Sea, absorb more CO2 more quickly than all other oceans combined. Above 450 ppm CO2 levels, which at current emissions, we will reach in about 14 years. Current polar marine ecosystems, including valuable fisheries, may largely cease to exist. Recovery from this is estimated to be 50,000 to 70,000 years. This means that regardless our efforts in the future, the situation of today will already have an adverse impact that will be recoverable only in dimensions of human timescales. So there we are. The situation of the climate change conferences. In 1995, there was the first COP meeting in Berlin. Since then, we have 26. I've listed here the most important because there are also some like half COPs in between these conferences. I also indicated in blue those I attended, which doesn't make me a climate change expert. By today, the process became so complicated that nobody can claim to have an overview still of all the parallel processes and technical issues. So then Glasgow. Of course, it's impossible to really give you even some highlights on the outcome of the conference and what was discussed. I've listed here, indicated, sorry, a very useful link with a good overview of what has been discussed there. Some highlights. For the first time, there was an explicit reference in the negotiation texts to phasing down unabated coal power and phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Up till today, the word fossil fuel subsidies was never explicitly mentioned in a negotiation text. The critique is that it is too vague. Here, it was originally written phasing out unabated coal power, and the last moment China and India made to change this into phasing down, which is of course much more vague. And of course, it's almost ironic. Inefficient, nobody knows really what inefficient or efficient, what the difference is between inefficient and efficient fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, you would say it's rather trivial that you would phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Secondly, there is also completion of a rule book for new carbon markets, like an extension of the mechanisms that were under the Kyoto Protocol. Countries can really exchange credits and by that allow themselves to emit more, actually. So the critique is that it is a greenwashing monster, and there's also in these things a lack of attention to human rights, free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples. Simply said, industrialized nations can build clean technology, for instance, or build forests or large hydro dams in developing countries and gain credits with that. But there is no real regime to really check if that can really not harm the environment and the indigenous peoples over there. And also there is a call for developed countries to double their adaptation finance by 2025. Adaptation finance is really the financial support towards developing countries to help them to adapt to climate change. And of course, you would say, well, maybe this one is naive, but for me, it's very sensitive also. There's no single reference to the possibility and potential of degrowth in the official conference. The conference itself, there were 40,000 people registered. Of them were like 25,000 on average in Glasgow throughout the 2 weeks. They gathered in COVID pandemic circumstances, and I think that went relatively well with self-tests and masks. The UN, of course, understood immediately that a vaccination could not be a criterion, because otherwise that would be very discriminative towards the developing countries. The UK presidency called in the beginning this COP the most inclusive COP ever. And at the same time, the activists, but also research and myself, from my own experience, I thought it was not true. I mean, many times the observers were like excluded out of negotiations, and many times the COVID pandemic was really used as an excuse in that sense. So finally, my own work there. So as Susan already introduced, I act in the global research NGO group, the constituency. So very briefly, how is a COP organized? You have the presidency, the organizer, and the member states. So you have actually a political arena which is surrounded by an agora. You have the member states negotiating, and you have the observers all around, thousands of NGOs being there. And they are organized in constituencies, private sector, environmental, local authorities, indigenous people, women and gender, youth, farmers, labor organizations, and research. And I act in the steering committee representing these research constituencies. So what do? We are the liaison between the scientific organizations and United Nations Climate Change Secretariat. We were established in 2003 on a request of the United Nations. We now represent 900 member organizations worldwide. These are all universities or institutions, research institutions. And it's embodied in a form of a steering committee of volunteers. We are all doing this volunteer. Nobody is paying us for this. So the task, we are acting as a service provider to scientific organizations. At conferences, we organize daily meetings. information hub, advice, networking. We coordinate the representation of the global scientific world in negotiation process, working groups and expert committees. And also we communicate, of course, with the other NGO groups with whom we have really very good relationships. At conferences, we organize meetings with ministers, conference presidents, and coordinators of the parallel negotiation processes. We also really talk about our own research, and we do critical evaluation of processes and policy issues. And finally, we are the voice of the global scientific world at the COP conferences themselves. We have our plenary statements, participation in working groups, and we write letters to the Climate Change Secretariat. This is my last slide. So in Glasgow, of course, the research constituency is most visible when we address the UN and the world on stage, as you have also seen the world leaders standing there. The topics of concern we really raise in our statements are capacity building, especially in developing countries, gender equity, evidence-based policy, education and training, transdisciplinarity and inclusion in research, and partnerships with the private sector. And in our final closing statement, and this of course is very relevant to the SHARE network, we highlighted, we reminded the world that science is more than the science of models and numbers. In order to understand the complexity of climate change, its origins, consequences, and solutions, science needs a holistic perspective enriched with insights and ideas from the social sciences and humanities, from indigenous knowledge and the arts, and from civil society and citizens. Voila, that's my introduction. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaston. Over to Joost.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to join this discussion, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Gaston, for already a great introduction, and that allows me to, well, that way I don't have to introduce some of the things that are relevant to my approach to the COP. Let me quickly share my screen. So my view of the COPs is more the view from the outside. I've never actually been inside the negotiations, yet I've been following COPs for, well, at least since the run up to the COP21 Paris conference. So that's since 2014. My perspective focuses on that of social movements, and in particular social movements that act around the COP. There's, of course, social movements or at least non-governmental organizations that participate inside the COPs, that have observer status. But there's also, and many will recognize this image, a lot of protests and actions around COP. So in the streets, typically in the cities where the COPs take place, but often also in worldwide mobilizations, taking place typically in the middle weekend of the COP or at the beginning of the COP. And so the picture that I think comes to mind when thinking of this is something like this. This is a picture from Copenhagen, 2009, one of the most high-level COPs, one of the most high-profile COPs, especially from the point of view of civil society. But the whole world actually looked at COP 2009 because it needed to replace the Kyoto Protocol. And in that sense, it was often framed as a now or never moment to save the climate. And the picture we see here is of course, people marching in the street to demand action. We see it literally on this sign here, blah, blah, blah. Sounds familiar. In COP26, we heard the same, of course. And the slogan, Act Now. The slogan, Act Now, probably quite well covers the typical image that we have of COP mobilizations, namely, it is people in the street in demonstrations who demand that the global leaders inside the COP take the action necessary to do something about climate change. While that sounds obvious and while it's partially true, my research over the years actually shows that this is a simplified picture of what COP mobilizations are about. This banner on the right, quite interestingly, however, suggests that when they meet, we mobilize, that it is almost an automatic response to COP mobilization. And so since 1992, since the Rio Earth Summit agreement on to have annual COP meetings, we've seen the emergence in particular in the early days of the Climate Action Network as the main actor of organizing the climate movement, focusing on reformist interventions. So not necessarily making very radical claims, but rather trying to push global leaders to be more ambitious in their commitments to climate change. But we see a radicalization and a split within the climate movement around the year 2007, when we see a split between the Climate Action Network on the one hand, representing the more reformist organizations, and the Climate Justice Network on the other, focusing indeed the emphasis on climate justice. Climate justice basically being the demand that the costs and the responsibilities with regards to climate change are divided fairly. At the moment, that is of course not the case. At the moment, those groups in the world who have least responsibility for causing climate change are also the groups who are carrying the greatest costs for climate change. And so that is a politicizing narrative around which there emerges a split within the climate movement, a conflict within the climate movement around 2007. And that conflict comes very much to the surface in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, when we see actually a more or less split mobilization. So as I mentioned already, the COP 2009 Copenhagen is important to understand the history of climate activism around COPs, because it is probably up to that date the most high profile one, and also one that still resonates until today, I think, in influencing what COP activism looks like. So I mentioned that the COP15 in Copenhagen was a COP of very high expectations. It was framed as the last COP to save the planet. And it was also expected that the COP would deliver on that, or at least by some media reports framed it like that. Similarly, there was a very high level mobilization. The climate movement came together in numbers that until that moment hadn't been seen before, and that also fueled the expectation that the climate movement might be successful in Copenhagen. However, the mobilization in Copenhagen was also characterized by a lack of coordination between these different groups that were in conflict with each other. So on the one hand, reformist groups under the Climate Action Network, and the more radical groups under the Climate Justice Network and Climate Justice Action, where CAN on the one hand focused on lobbying and supportive demonstrations, while, for instance, Climate Justice Action especially focused on disrupting the process and trying to delegitimize the inaction of world leaders. Ultimately, there overall was mainly a very big disappointment, and what some people have called the Copenhagen hangover. So these very high levels of expectation for the COP were actually smashed. So people lost hope for the climate. Many people, both activists and others involved in climate action, experienced burnout. And what is more, because the Copenhagen summit was framed as the last moment to do something about climate change, there was actually no real after-COP strategy. There was no idea how to continue after this disappointment. And so this quote from the American Rising Tide group, more or less radical climate action group, I think covers quite well the sentiment around COP around that time. So they wrote that the sooner we realize that politicians and corporations will not solve the climate crisis, the sooner we can get to the real work of building a strong grassroots people's movement, our only hope for survival. In that regard, the failure of the December 2009 UN climate meetings in Copenhagen may be a great opportunity. Yet at COP21, which is more or less where my research began, we see again a return of the climate movement to the COP with greater numbers than ever before, with a focus on building a global movement for after the COP. So organizers try to emphasize the moment after the COP. And so we see this combination of attraction and repulsion. On the one hand, the activists want nothing to do with the COP because they think it's a greenwashing exercise, it's ineffective. Yet they are there because they want to make use of the momentum around the topic, and they want to make sure that the global leaders and the corporations don't only frame that moment around climate action, and they want to have their influence on the narrative, as well as use the momentum for afterwards. Ultimately, that turned out to be quite difficult for the movement. Media framing continued to frame them as being focused on trying to push the ambitions of the politicians, even though actually they had no expectations of the politicians whatsoever. So that was a framing that was, well, not entirely accurate, and that the movement tried to avoid, but that it found very difficult to do. In the years after COP, we see indeed a spread of direct action. So the movement taking measures into its own hands, as it promised, such as on the picture here, a mine occupation in Germany under the banner of Ende Gelände. So stopping the things that politicians apparently refuse to stop, as well as focusing on concrete alternatives. So the real solutions, as the movements like to call it. So very briefly, I'm running out of time. COP26 then follows 5 years after Paris, or actually 5 years after Paris, and represents a moment, probably the next highest level COP, or the most high profile COP since Paris. And here we saw familiar faces in the activist scenes, as well as a new generation of activists coming together. What was distinctive about this COP was that a shift had focused to a very strong focus on what the activists call MAPA, the most affected people and areas, as well as indigenous people, framing them as groups that need to be defended, for instance, from offsetting, but also from, for instance, hydropower, as well as groups to learn the real solutions from, because they are framed as groups who have lived in harmony with nature, and that we should learn to reharmonize our way of living with nature as well. Interestingly, and this is, I think, the bridge to our discussion, what has emerged over time in these discussions is a very strong focus on real and false solutions. So what started as pushing for climate action in general, in a time when perhaps the issue was that we still needed to convince powerful people that this was an important issue, that doesn't seem to be the issue so much anymore. Most politicians are now convinced that this is indeed an existential threat for humanity and something that we need to act on very fast. But the political issue is really how we should focus on that. One of the issues is whether we should focus on technological solutions, technological promises of the future, or on radical societal transformations. For instance, discussions about whether or not we are consuming too much as a society, and whether or not we try to fulfill ourselves as individuals too much on the basis of consumerist needs. And so that debate around real and false solutions, I think, is something that Gaston and I will dive in a bit deeper. And we will immediately do that really through the case of nuclear, and I think we will look at other discussions around real and false solutions after that as well. So perhaps I now pass over again to you, Gaston, with the question how the nuclear was discussed at COP26, as well as how it was both promoted and contested, and whether this narrative of real and false solutions is something that we see as much inside the COP as we see it outside the COP.
Okay, thank you, Joost, for this really nice overview of the activist movement outside. So well, normally I try to be inside and outside as much as I can. This time in Glasgow, I haven't had the time to go to the Counter Summit, which was really a pity. So of course, well, to just answer your question immediately, nuclear energy as a possible energy technology option combating climate change has never been officially discussed in the official political negotiations since the beginning of the COPs. Before I go further on that, it is if you look at the state of the planet I gave now, really focusing on the targets. Really designed by the Paris Agreement, and looking at we are going now, so the production gap. Of course, this will be like the ultimate argument for nuclear to really make its case, and it's trying to do that. Of course, it's much more complex. It's because as long as fossil fuels remain cheap and available for countries like China and India, they will of course rather choose for that than going a complex route. But most of these countries really play on different tracks now at the same time. But looking at false solutions, and I'm really happy you also highlight the idea of savings and degrowth, because I think in a world obsessed with consumerism and economic growth and continuing industrialization, I would call every energy or climate technology a false solution. So I think we can only really talking about nuclear specifically. I think we should only consider nuclear within a global energy policy perspective that first prioritizes and maximizes energy savings, so moving away from the dogma of economic growth, and prioritizes and maximizes the use of renewables. Only then, I think, we can see if and how a democratic society can consider the two risk-inherent technologies we still have from modernity, nuclear and fossil fuels, and carbon capture and storage, how they can be used to produce what we cannot do yet with renewables and energy savings. We always, and now I'm talking from an ethical perspective, evaluating nuclear technology is troubled by moral pluralism. You can formulate evidence-based rationales to prove it's contributing to sustainable development, and you can formulate evidence-based rationales to prove it is not. So the only thing you can do is to make sure it is treated democratically with full inclusion of civil society and citizens' representation. And if it's democratically accepted, it will be better accepted. If it's democratically rejected, it will be better rejected. And I would really turn it back to you now. And I guess it was highlighted also in the Counter Summit, or was it not?
Well, interestingly, of course, I cannot speak for the whole Counter Summit, because what you need to have in mind with the Counter Summit is actually quite a large and ambitious event. Maybe it's also good to know for the audience how this works. It's often the local networks of climate activists who take responsibility for organizing a Counter Summit. I'm not entirely sure whether there was a Counter Summit at every COP, but it has become a bit of a tradition in the climate movement. So climate activists, they come together, typically the local groups, they take responsibility to organize a similar summit, of course, of a smaller scale than the COP, but where alternative visions, more critical visions of the climate problem, but also of climate solutions are discussed. And so in Glasgow, this I think was done at quite an ambitious level. This Counter Summit took around 4 days. And during those 4 days, running from the early morning till the late evening, there was constantly around 4 or 5 panels going on, workshops where, well, like I mentioned, for instance, real and false solutions were discussed, but also how should the movement organize, how should the movement deal with internal tensions, etc. And so I don't have a complete overview of everything that was said there, because I couldn't attend all the parallel sessions. But my view, and I try to select especially those settings where solutions to the climate crisis were discussed, both real and false ones, as the climate activists call them. Nuclear was hardly mentioned. In general, actually, it was a summit where technological solutions were either criticized or not really mentioned. And that for me was actually an interesting transition from the prior COP in that I observed, namely COP21 in Paris. Of course, France is well known as a country with a big nuclear industry, and there this was more of an issue. But it was also more of an issue how energy could be produced in a clean way, so the real alternatives. So in Paris, the discussion on real alternatives, on real solutions, still focused much more on actual technological solutions. Whereas in COP26 in Glasgow, for me, from my point of view at least, this discussion of real and false solutions had shifted more towards rejecting technological solutions overall, or at least the overemphasis on technological solutions, and in place emphasizing the more human, social, economic dimensions. So how are we living, especially as Western societies, the unsustainability of our consumerist societies, but also the very strong emphasis, as I mentioned already, on indigenous people, both as groups that need to be protected from a climate justice point of view, but also groups that might inspire us, that might teach us how we can live in harmony with nature. Of course, there is that's a problematic discourse, because it risks sort of colonizing again these people as the source of solutions. But it was a context in which I think the discussion of nuclear was remarkably absent. And I guess we can interpret that in two ways. On the one hand, it's of course it's a divisive issue within the movement. Admittedly, it's the more reformist groups that might tend to accept it as a solution more willingly than the more radical groups. But of course, there are climate activists, and quite many climate activists, probably not a majority, but numerous climate activists who, of course, propose nuclear as a bridging fuel, for instance. On the other hand, I think we can interpret the absence of the discussion of nuclear, again, in light of this discussion, that there is increasingly the idea that we won't, whichever technology we use, we won't fix our way out of this problem. We need to have that fundamental discussion, that fundamental societal discussion, for instance, around the question of degrowth, where the idea is that and for instance, the work of Tim Jackson is very interesting to look at in this context, where he quite convincingly shows that sort of incremental increases in the efficiency of our energy production will never be able to keep up, and actually they should outpace the exponential growth of our economy.
You refer to the book Prosperity Without Growth, I guess. Jackson. Yeah, it's really advisable for the audience. If you don't know it, it's a good read still. But I'm not surprised you say in the Counter Summit nuclear was not highlighted, because since COP3 the nuclear industry representation realized they should be at climate change conferences, which they immediately did. Foratom, the European lobby organization representing the industry, the World Nuclear Association, the Japan Atomic Industry Forum, the Nuclear Energy Institute from the US, they were all there, but they were in the corridors as NGOs next to all the other NGOs. And of course, they tried to make their case, but they were largely ignored. I mean, but of course, the other way around too, there was no dialogue. And I remember, and of course, they also did workshops the way other NGOs did workshops. I'm always a bit frustrated with the simplistic picture the media paint from a climate change conference. Of course, there's the political dialogue. Of course, there is the much needed protest outside. But inside, there is the agora of thousands of NGOs I mentioned in my presentation that really discuss on all matters of climate change. I call it really the global gathering of the consciousness of the world. And of course, these activists and the people inside, they have really tight liaisons, many of them, of course. But I remember there was the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is ironically a UN body also, has its workshop, and it was in the climate change conference in Nairobi. I forgot the year. I can't find it in my list. But so there was a workshop organized by the International Atomic Energy Agency about the potential of nuclear. And I met a guy from Climate Action Network. I knew him from a long time, and I asked him, "Are you intending to go to the workshop? Because you have to go there and make your anti-nuclear case there." And then he said something very interesting. He said, "No, we don't go there. We don't go to these workshops. Because if we go there, we give the impression to the world that nuclear would be debatable in principle. And that's their basic motivation for their denial of everything happens around nuclear." But of course, that's one interesting position, even from a philosophical point of view, but it has never been present in the political arena, as I said, and the reason is that the countries don't want it. The member states up till now didn't want it. Those countries with the government in favor didn't want it because they don't want to give account of that policy on the international scene. Those against don't want it because they don't want the issue to become debatable. And now we see since a few years, some countries are making an open plea for nuclear. Among them, we have seen the position paper of 10 European Union member states who wrote something in the run-up to COP26. Besides Finland and France, it's mostly Eastern European countries. But responsibility and accountability with regard to nuclear will always be relegated to national level. And countries can do what they want. And that's at the same time also an ultimate freeway for the international commercial nuclear industry. And of course, we know there is regulation for licensing, but we know the possibility of influence, democratic influence from citizens and civil society in these processes is very limited to non-existing. And therefore, I repeat my message, nuclear should be pulled into the center of the climate change negotiations, along the other energy technologies, not to promote it, but to make sure it undergoes a democratic scrutiny it is escaping actually now.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that because you mentioned before that well, we need to first talk about our energy needs, but then once we've done that, we can consider in a democratic way what the place of nuclear should be. And you mentioned now also that in the current arrangements, this is very much delegated to the nation state. So one of the main difficulties that I foresee here is the difficulty that there is not really a global civil society. There probably will never be. And so, of course, nuclear, even though the power plants will stand in one particular country, of course, the effects of nuclear waste disposal of a potential nuclear disaster, of course, transcend the limits of the country. So is it actually possible to democratize such a discussion? Isn't that a reason to, well, like your CAN contact, to stay away from it and to just keep it simple, just try to delegitimize it as much as possible?
Yeah, before you can actually introduce an international liability regime where countries who want to build nuclear have to really cooperate with the surrounding countries, you first have to really create a spirit in which this becomes possible. And I remember I also follow the Sustainable Development process of the United Nations, and there was a Commission on Sustainable Development meeting. It's a similar United Nations gathering. This one was in New York, and there, under facilitation of the UN, there was a commission on energy, and nuclear was not mentioned, which is like highly hypocrite simply because it exists. Again, not to promote it or to attack it, but it exists. And there are countries in the official negotiation text at the end, they really put in a footnote that they agreed to disagree about nuclear. And that was all. There was nothing else mentioned there. And what on an international level could be done, of course, is to really highlight the importance of democratic decision-making and participation of civil society, at least already at the national and the local level. And that's something that can be done, introduced, not forced, of course, because we will always be limited to soft law, introduced and stimulated from top down, from an international. Look at the Aarhus Convention, the Convention on the access to information, public participation, and the access to justice. It's a UN-based convention, and everything you need for large technological installations, such as nuclear, is in there. But of course, it's again soft law, and so things will never converge if there is no international common spirit that something needs to be done. But again, one more thing. If you really listen to presentations from nuclear experts, and of course also the lobby organizations, really explaining the need for nuclear, they always begin their presentation almost literally with the first slide saying, energy demand is on a rise. And that is their ultimate agreement, not only climate change, but the ultimate argument, so I would say, to really make a plea for nuclear. As long as also there the degrowth discussion really comes in, then it will always be talking people on parallel lines, parallel tracks next to each other.
Yeah, perhaps one final thought, because I think there I see two questions in the chat, and so perhaps it's time to slowly turn our attention to that. I was just thinking one other source of hesitance that I noticed from, even though it's not explicitly discussed like that, but a wider discussion from the climate movement, and probably a skepsis towards democratizing and politicizing nuclear, is that any outcome towards nuclear would undermine democracy from the point of view of energy democracy, which is an interesting concept that perhaps is interesting also for the audience to look into. And here, what climate movements often do is they introduce the question of interests and of power. The COP itself is often, well, depoliticizes the discussion of sustainability, acts as if we all are in the same boat, but actually there are, of course, interests, and these interests are represented and create power imbalances. And I'm thinking of the way in which Andreas Malm, for instance, introduces this dual understanding of power. Power means energy, electricity, but power also means political power. So who is in power over electricity, of course, also has a lot of political power. And so nuclear is, of course, the ultimate centralized form of power, and it makes a very small group of people in charge of power. And so I think one of the real solutions that the movements see is that, while overall processes need to be democratized, power needs to be taken away from corporations and from nation states and towards the people. And that and democratizing energy itself, the production of energy, making that a community-owned resource, is in itself a step towards democratizing society, and in itself, therefore, a step towards sustainability. So I think that's sort of, even if nuclear would be a clean solution, as its proponents propose, I think there would still be the power dimension of it and the democracy dimension, where the critical onlookers would always oppose it.
I see there's a first question for you, Joost, in the chat. Has there been any suggestion that differences between CAN you see?
Okay. Has there been any suggestions that differences between CAN, CGN, and CGA might have been fostered by antagonists, climate change deniers, and others resisting meaningful change, seeking to undermine, discredit activists?
A conspiracy theory.
I am not aware of any such suggestions, and I think actually I would be surprised if that was the case, or at least I think the explanation that I just gave, I think, is sufficiently convincing. The climate movement was growing up around that time, was becoming a real movement, a political movement, became increasingly aware of its own political message. So beyond saying politicians be ambitious, we see around 2007 also a peak in global justice activism. So the global justice movement, who, for instance, advocates for a redistribution of wealth globally, and a fusion of that movement with the climate movement, and introducing that global justice perspective. And so I think there was a very natural, well, of course, natural is a problematic term, but a sort of organic process towards these movements merging, as well as the conflicts emerging from that. So I don't think the movement needed outside influence to create that conflict. What is important to mention, I think, is also that those conflicts, even though the climate movement, of course, is so broad, it's as broad as the topic of climate change itself, so it will always be a conflictual movement. But since COP 2009, and especially around COP21 in Paris, I think the movement has learned a lot on how to work together and how to coordinate, for instance, insider strategies and outsider strategies, and to have discussions across the political divides within the movement in more or less productive ways.
Okay, the second question: how were carbon capture solutions discussed at COP26 or the Counter Summit? To what extent these discussions were different from preceding COPs? CCS has been discussed for many years already, but more in the agora of scientific and consultancy NGOs, rather than like an official topic in the negotiations itself. I guess it's seen as a potential technological solution, but I think many countries, and especially the UN, are reluctant to really present it as a possible solution. They're rather focused still on really lowering the use of fossil fuels than using CCS as an excuse to just continue doing it. So I don't know about the Counter Summit, Joost. Is it a technology that has been?
This was one of the technologies that was discussed quite a bit, unlike nuclear, and of course very critically. It's mainly seen as an excuse for inaction, right? It's basically saying we can continue doing what we are doing now. We can continue making the mess. We can clean it up later. It's often presented as fairy tales about future technologies that at the moment haven't been proven to work at scale. I think the main problem with it, at least among the specialists, because obviously not every climate activist knows much about this, but I think the main issue with it is that CCS doesn't in itself lower our emissions, because you still need the energy to run the CCS. It costs a lot of energy to capture the carbon. So if you are running CCS on carbon energy, your net effect will still be negative.
Yeah.
CCS only works in a situation where you have so much surplus green energy that you can start powering this vacuum cleaner for carbon. But of course, we all know that we are very, very far away from that situation.
And it's also a deviation from the real potential of CCS by nature itself, of course. So looking at forestation, the potential of peatlands, and that's the real CCS potential. But of course, that's not technology, and it cannot be taken up in a business model, of course. Do I still have time, Susan, to really have this last question in the chat?
There's a couple of questions there which really open up this question that you sort of started to address around the role of democratic processes.
Yes. Yeah, there's a question. It's a very long question, so I invite also the participants to actually read it, because I'm not going to read it.
No, don't read it.
It's about democracy around. It's about democracy around nuclear. You said that the decision, you talked about solutions, is better accepted. It's an outcome of democratic process. However, in the field of nuclear energy, one can easily see that it's not that obvious, which is true, of course. And our participant makes a reference to the process in France around waste. That's true. Well, I would say if there is something that can be called democracy around nuclear, like siting of a waste disposal site, for instance, then it's up till now always very fragmented. It has never been taken up in a robust process that really discusses the justification of nuclear energy as such from in the beginning. I remember I started my presentation in Fukushima. A few years after the accident, we had a big conference in Fukushima around the Fukushima accident, of course. And I said, imagine that the nuclear power plants in Japan were democratically introduced with big support, with backup from civil society and citizens. What would have been the perception of the accident of the people now? So you always have to look at how you can really organize a robust democracy process around specific technology solutions. Also, renewables, by the way, face the same problem. The not in my backyard syndrome is now also present in the discussions around wind farms, for instance. So you cannot really, there's good attempts, but they will always be fragmented if they're not placed into a larger, more democratic process around the very justification of nuclear itself.
I might just briefly follow up, because I do think that it is important to keep in mind that democracy, probably like sustainability, is the kind of term that can mean anything and everything, and that can very much be used to depoliticize certain processes. And that's a discussion that has been going on very long in the literature on democratic participation and on, for instance, consultancy procedures, where it is often shown that what is presented as democratic participation is actually a closed-ended process that is only implemented to legitimize a pre-existing decision. The same can be said for the term sustainability. It's often applied as a label to something to basically say, how can you disagree with that? Aren't we all on board with this idea of sustainability or democracy? So I think that we need to be very careful and critical when we apply this argument of democratizing certain processes, because they have been shown to often lead to things that are, well, far from what we have in mind with democracy.
Yeah, thank you both. I want to pose the final question. I will take chair's privilege. Very, very briefly, what do you see as the top research priority from your perspective for particularly the social scientists within the SHARE research platform?
You want to go first, Joost, or I can do?
I can go first. I think that there is especially a need, from the point of view of the research field that I know, of course, there is a great need to integrate the discussion of alternative visions, of mainstream visions, and especially to think about this question of how can we deal with trade-offs within them? Discussions around real and false solutions are often reduced to discussions around pros and cons. And that's because this research field is often fragmentized. The discussion focuses, for instance, on one possible solution, and then the discussion evolves around whether that is a good idea or not. A more integrated assessment of how we as a society might think about risks around benefits, around costs of various trajectories is of course much more complex and much more difficult to organize, either as someone who wants to democratize these processes or someone who's simply interested in how people think about this. But that for me, I think is really essential to get a better grasp of how people think about and how people navigate these different trade-offs that are necessarily involved. Because we do have to move away from this picture that we can solve climate change in a way that ultimately we will all be better off. I'm convinced that there will be costs, that there will be difficult costs that are hard to carry, that we need to have a more honest discussion around these trade-offs. And that for me, I think, is the path towards a more democratized discussion. Of course, in that context, the question, who is the demos, who is the people, remains a very difficult one. But overall, that for me is an essential area to focus on.
Thank you. And Gaston?
Yeah, I think I can add to that. Well, in my seminars and presentations, I'm often counted with irony, people saying that I'm naive, like making a plea for a reform of politics, better participation of civil society and citizens, deliberative democracy. But then, of course, I always say there's two things. There's an ethical discussion on the long term about the reform of society, and that's something that is happening in the climate change debate too. I mean, for instance, on degrowth also. But at the same time, we can also be pragmatic and look at what we can already do now today. What does it mean to really improve democratic decision making, to really improve trust in decision making, also in the climate change governance process? And I think social sciences and humanities research networks really can have an important contribution there in really, I mean, I know, Susan, we have been doing that already, public participation around concrete cases, the use of ionizing radiation, but that intelligence that is already there can really put forward and distribute it to the broader world. It's really thinking from out of pragmatic, but also normative perspectives. From justice perspectives, how can we make this decision making better? And not only the nuclear energy issue will benefit from that. As I said, if it's accepted democratically, it will be better accepted. If it's rejected, it will be better rejected. But also the climate change governance process in itself. And everything we need is there. I mean, there's, I don't want to end with like the trivial thing saying there's a lack of political will. It's that, but it's more. There's more than it's really coming up with better ideas still about methods, about forms, not only about technical solutions and so on, but also methods. How do we make sense of all these? And that is actually at the moment also still lacking in the climate change conference agoras around the negotiation process.
Thank you both. Thank you both, particularly for your responses there to that final question, because one thing I was struck by in your discussion was this apparent need not only for social science to have a voice, but for social sciences and humanities to constantly prove that they should be heard in the first place. So there is almost a twin track challenge for researchers there, is not only to do their work, but to constantly justify why their work has a place in these discussions, which of course normally science and engineering do not have to justify their position at the table in quite the same way. A massive thank you to both of you for that absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer. So I've noted in the chat that we will be continuing some of these discussions at the forthcoming RICOMET conference in Utrecht next year. Obviously, you are both working in this area already, as are many other members of SHARE. So, of course, papers are constantly being written and presentations given on these topics. Thank you very much. And I would invite all the participants, thank you for your participation and for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't discuss them in more detail. But please do go to the SHARE website, join the organisation, review the recording, which I will be doing shortly also, and continue asking questions and come along and discuss these further at RICOMET and in other venues. A very good Christmas and a very hopeful, safe and well 2022 to everybody. Thank you so much and goodbye.